December 1944, Camp Algona, Iowa. The prairie wind cut through the wire fences like a blade. Snow fell in slow, heavy flakes, dusting the gray barracks where hundreds of German prisoners stood watching. Across the compound, American guards in wool coats hammered wooden beams into place, a small building taking shape in the cold. The sound of the hammers echoed between the watchtowers. One prisoner, a young Luftwaffe mechanic named Hans, squinted at the half-built structure. It wasn't another barracks. It wasn't a storehouse. It had a raised platform, curtains, rows of seats. A stage, word spread through the camp. The guards were building a theater. Some men laughed, thinking it a cruel joke. Others whispered that it was propaganda, a trap, something that couldn't possibly be real. But each morning the Americans kept working, painting, wiring lights, laying down planks. And when they finally hung the curtain, something in the air shifted. Even in captivity, the prisoners would soon perform plays, German plays, under the gaze of the men who had defeated them. To understand why their captors built them a stage, we must step back to a world still engulfed in war. By late 1942, the war had swallowed the globe. Europe burned from the Channel to the Volga. In North Africa, German divisions were crumbling under Allied pressure. Across the Atlantic, the United States, industrial giant, now fully mobilized, faced a new challenge: what to do with the thousands of captured enemy soldiers flooding in from distant battlefields. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were to be treated humanely, fed, housed, and protected from harm. But few could have predicted the scale to come. By the war's end, over 425,000 German POWs would be shipped to more than 700 camps across the United States. From the arid deserts of Arizona to the frozen plains of the Midwest, these men, soldiers of Hitler's armies, suddenly found themselves behind barbed wire on the other side of the world. It was a surreal reversal. Only years before, the same men had fought under the banners of a regime that enslaved millions. Now they were safe, clothed, and alive, in a nation they had been taught to see as weak and decadent. The U.S. War Department faced a delicate balance. America needed these men, not as soldiers but as laborers. With so many American men overseas, farms and factories at home were starved of manpower. German POWs became an unexpected workforce, harvesting crops, repairing rail lines, even building roads under military supervision. For their labor, they were paid in camp-issued scrip, redeemable at canteens that sold cigarettes, chocolate, and soap. Yet this pragmatic approach soon evolved into something more ambitious. American commanders realized that the POW camps could serve a second purpose, one not of war, but of ideology. If the United States could demonstrate the moral strength of democracy, even to its enemies, it might plant seeds that would grow long after the conflict ended. It was a quiet contest of values, and it began not with weapons, but with books, classrooms, and stages. Within months, the War Department authorized the creation of re-education programs, though the term was carefully disguised to avoid violating the Geneva Convention's rule against political indoctrination. Officially, these were called intellectual diversion activities, but their intent was clear: to expose captured Germans to ideas of freedom, individualism, and responsibility, to unlearn what Nazism had taught them. To that end, the camps developed libraries filled with banned books, Goethe, Schiller, Thomas Mann, and even American classics like Mark Twain. Newspapers written by POWs circulated inside the wire, censored only for propaganda. Lectures were held. Classes in English, history, and economics filled the evenings. Still, none of it compared to the most curious form of all: theater. Theater, the Americans believed, could reach where lectures could not. It spoke to the imagination, the conscience, the soul, and many of the German soldiers, former students, teachers, or actors, still carried fragments of cultural pride that the Nazi state had distorted but not destroyed. The idea of building them a stage seemed absurd to many guards at first, yet it was approved from the top. If the prisoners could see art flourish under freedom, even in captivity, perhaps they might begin to question the system they once fought for. Across the country, small wooden theaters began to rise inside the wire, at Camp Algona, Camp Tonkawa, Camp Trinidad, and dozens of others. POWs crafted sets from scrap wood and painted backdrops from flour sacks. They rehearsed comedies, dramas, and even religious plays in their own language. To the locals beyond the fence, it was an odd sight. German soldiers, once feared invaders, now actors performing Faust or the Merry Wives of Windsor in front of their American guards. And yet, the performances drew quiet crowds. Soldiers watched. Officers took notes. Reporters were rarely allowed, but the stories trickled out. Something rare was unfolding. A war being fought through kindness and culture, not bullets. As the curtain rose on those makeshift stages, the irony was impossible to ignore. Here, in the heartland of the enemy, Germany's sons were rediscovering the freedom of art, the very thing their homeland had surrendered to tyranny. It was not propaganda. It was reclamation. And as the snow melted on the barbed wire fences that winter, the experiment was only beginning. The camp theaters were more than just diversions. They were quiet laboratories of the mind, places where two civilizations, once locked in mortal struggle, began to study each other in the flicker of stage lights. In 1943, the U.S. Army established the Special Projects Division, a secretive branch tasked with overseeing the intellectual activities of enemy prisoners. Led by academics, psychologists, and linguists, this division saw the POW camps as an opportunity to shape the moral recovery of Germany itself. Its mission wasn't revenge. It was reconstruction before peace. By this time, the war in Europe was turning. The German Sixth Army had been destroyed at Stalingrad. Italy was falling. Nazi propaganda was losing its grip. And as American victory seemed inevitable, Washington began thinking beyond the battlefield, toward a post-war Germany that might be rebuilt, not just occupied. Re-education, therefore, became a subtle weapon. It couldn't be forced. The Geneva Convention forbade coercion. But it could be offered. And culture was the perfect vessel. The POWs, many of whom were conscripts or ordinary laborers, found themselves confronting questions they had never been allowed to ask at home. In Germany, the arts had long been weaponized, turned into tools of obedience and fear. Theater, once a mirror to human conscience, had become a stage for Nazi heroism and myth. Inside the camps, that changed. Here, under American supervision, German prisoners could choose what to perform. They rediscovered banned playwrights, Brecht, Goethe, Schiller, voices that had been silenced by the Reich. They wrote new plays, some satirical, others tragic. They acted out moral conflicts that reflected their own. In one camp, a group of officers staged Wilhelm Tell, a story of rebellion against tyranny. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The Americans watched in silence. The Germans bowed under the applause of the very men they once called enemies. Camp newspapers published reviews of the performances. The War Department circulated reports, noting that prisoners engaged in such artistic programs displayed notable improvement in discipline and cooperation. Guards described the atmosphere as calmer, even friendly. Some Americans began to see their captives not as soldiers, but as men caught in the machinery of ideology. Outside the camps, nearby towns were often unaware of what occurred beyond the fences. Farmers who worked alongside the POWs knew them simply as the Germans, but occasionally, word spread that behind the wire music played, and laughter could be heard. One evening in 1944, at Camp Algona, townspeople were invited to a Christmas concert. Under guard escort, civilians sat beside soldiers in folding chairs as a POW orchestra performed Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. For a brief hour, war and peace existed in the same breath. The Americans were not naive. They knew not every prisoner could be reached. Some remained loyal to the Reich, bitter and unrepentant. In certain camps, Nazi sympathizers intimidated others, creating hidden hierarchies of control. The War Department responded by segregating the hardcore prisoners from those deemed educable. But the effort continued, careful, patient, relentless. It wasn't about changing the past. It was about preparing for the future. By 1945, as Allied troops crossed the Rhine and the Third Reich neared collapse, many POWs in American camps were performing plays about guilt, redemption, and homecoming. Their scripts spoke of longing, of uncertainty, of worlds destroyed. In letters later found in archives, prisoners wrote of their confusion. "We cannot understand why the Americans treat us so well," one former U-boat officer confessed. They give us books, music, and respect, things we had forgotten were human. And that confusion was precisely the point. The contrast between the totalitarian world they left and the democratic one they now witnessed was the most powerful lesson of all. The stage, it turned out, was not merely a place of entertainment. It was a mirror, one that forced the prisoners to confront what their nation had become and what they themselves might still be. Beneath the lights of those makeshift theaters, the seeds of a quiet revolution were taking root, not of arms, but of ideas, and soon in the coming months, that revolution would find its most human expression, not in strategy or politics, but in the fragile act of performance. The human angle for most of the German prisoners, captivity in America felt like stepping into another universe. The war had stripped them of rank and power, but in the quiet rhythm of camp life, they rediscovered something more subtle: humanity. Days began early. Roll call under the rising sun. Work details at nearby farms or factories. The clang of tools, the hum of trucks beyond the wire, and then the long afternoons, stretches of time that begged to be filled. It was in these hours that the idea of the theater took root. For the prisoners, building sets and writing scripts became an escape not from the camp, but from themselves. Actors found solace in becoming other people, if only for an hour. Painters turned scenery into fragments of memory: a German village, a forest, a moonlit river. The audience, rows of weary soldiers, sat in rapt silence. These plays were never political, yet they pulsed with emotion. They spoke of home, of lost youth, of waiting wives and broken ideals. Some men wept quietly. Others laughed, momentarily forgetting their circumstances. The theater became a sanctuary, a fragile refuge built on planks and imagination. And through that act of creation, the walls of ideology began to soften. The moral angle for the American guards, the experiment demanded restraint. Many had brothers and friends fighting or buried in Europe. To show compassion toward the enemy required discipline of a different kind: moral courage. The Geneva Convention mandated fair treatment, but what unfolded in these camps went beyond legality. It was an expression of the American ideal, that even in war, decency must not be surrendered. Guards addressed prisoners by rank. Medical care matched that of U.S. soldiers. Letters home were permitted. And when the idea of a theater emerged, few objected. To the War Department, kindness was strategic. To the guards, it became personal. They saw the change in the prisoners, the way hostility gave way to humility, then curiosity. Many guards were farm boys and factory workers, not scholars. Yet as they watched the Germans rehearse Faust or Nathan the Wise, they began to see them as more than soldiers. They were men who, under different stars, might have been neighbors, even friends. Moral power, it seemed, could be stronger than barbed wire. The leadership angle behind the calm of camp life lay the deliberate design of American leadership. Officials at the War Department understood that victory on the battlefield would mean little without victory in the mind. The Special Projects Division, working quietly under the Provost Marshal General's office, crafted the framework. Its officers, many drawn from universities, believed that culture was the true foundation of democracy. They saw every POW camp as a classroom. Manuals were written, curriculums designed. Commanders received directives encouraging educational and cultural rehabilitation. They were to avoid overt propaganda and instead rely on example, freedom through behavior, not words. At Camp Algona, for instance, the commanding officer allowed prisoners to design the theater themselves. Lumber was supplied. The rest was left to them. The result astonished everyone: a 600-seat hall complete with curtains, stage lights, and painted scenery. The camp's education officer reported that discipline improved, tensions declined, and productivity rose. His conclusion was simple: the men who build and perform also begin to think. It was leadership not of domination, but of demonstration. The psychological angle to understand the theater's effect: one must consider what the prisoners had been taught to believe. Under Nazism, mercy was weakness and art served the state. In captivity, that logic unraveled. The American approach bewildered them. They expected vengeance, instead they found fairness. They expected humiliation, instead they were given dignity. Psychologists later noted that this moral inversion forced an internal reckoning. When the enemy treats you better than your own regime, doubt begins to grow in silence. Performing on stage made that process visible. The soldiers, once symbols of the Reich, now portrayed ordinary men in struggle, doubt, or love. In those roles, they rediscovered empathy. Some later said it was the first time they had truly thought about what they had believed. And for the Americans watching, it was proof that war could be fought not only with force, but with conscience. The theater had become a mirror, and through it, both sides began to see each other, and themselves, more clearly. The curtain of ideology was lifting, but the story was far from over. Soon, the stage lights would illuminate something even deeper, the enemy's soul confronting its own reflection. The German perspective. For many German prisoners, the first sight of American kindness was unsettling. These were men raised on a decade of propaganda that painted the Allies as monsters, brutal, decadent, soulless. Yet the reality inside the camps contradicted every image they had been fed. The confusion was palpable. In interviews years later, former POWs recalled their disbelief. One remembered being handed a bar of soap upon arrival and thinking it a trick. Another spoke of his shock at being allowed to write home. "We thought we would be treated as we treated Russians," one said quietly. "Instead, we were treated as men." That contradiction gnawed at them. If the enemy was human, perhaps even honorable, then what had they fought for? The theater accelerated that realization. Acting demanded empathy, imagination, and trust, qualities that totalitarian ideology had suppressed. When prisoners performed Der Biberpelz or Faust, they weren't just reciting lines. They were re-entering a moral world long exiled from their lives. One officer at Camp Algona described it later. "When we played those roles, we were no longer soldiers. We were human beings again." For the first time since the war began, these men could express doubt, grief, or tenderness, emotions censored under Nazism. The stage became a confessional, and the audience, both German and American, became witnesses to their rediscovery of conscience. The artistic angle art, even behind barbed wire, has a strange power. It humanizes captivity. The POW theaters proved that creativity could bloom in the most controlled spaces. Inside Camp Algona, the prisoners' theater became a marvel of improvisation. Sets were built from salvaged wood, costumes from flour sacks and curtain fabric. Props were carved from tin cans painted with pigments made of crushed berries and clay. Lighting was rigged from discarded bulbs and wires scavenged from the motor pool. What mattered wasn't the materials, it was the spirit. Each performance became a small act of defiance against despair. The repertoire was diverse: comedies, folktales, historical dramas, even operettas. One of the most popular performances was The Merry Farmer, a light-hearted musical that filled the camp with laughter for the first time in months. But beneath the humor, the plays often carried unspoken messages, reflections on guilt, pride, and redemption. Many of the actors later said that through theater, they learned to think again, to feel again. For the American officers, watching the plays became a kind of moral reassurance. They were not merely guarding prisoners, they were witnessing transformation. The War Department documented these cultural programs in reports now preserved in the National Archives. One noted, "The theater has become an instrument of order, morale, and self-respect. It proves that the enemy, treated as a man, may rediscover humanity." The cultural clash still, not everything was harmonious. Within the camps, deep ideological divisions simmered. Hardcore Nazis, often older officers or party loyalists, despised the theater. They saw it as weakness, even treason. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, tensions escalated when pro-Nazi prisoners accused others of collaborating with the Americans. In 1943, one German sergeant, Johannes Kunze, was murdered by fellow POWs for allegedly informing on them. His death shocked U.S. officials and prompted stricter segregation between unrepentant Nazis and moderates. The theater, ironically, became a dividing line between those still bound to the Reich and those beginning to free themselves from it. For those who embraced it, the stage was more than art. It was a declaration. Performing plays banned in Germany was an act of quiet rebellion, a reclamation of the cultural identity their government had stolen. And for the Americans watching, it confirmed a belief that the German soul, corrupted but not destroyed, could still be reached, outside the wire, American citizens also wrestled with the paradox. Some protested the luxuries given to prisoners while their own sons were dying overseas. Newspapers occasionally reported on the strange phenomenon: German soldiers staging plays in Iowa, Nebraska, or Texas, and with headlines that mixed curiosity and outrage. But military officials defended the program firmly. "This is not sentimentality," one officer explained. "It is strategy. If we win them in the mind, we will never fight them again." Over time, skepticism gave way to quiet respect. The theaters became symbols of American confidence, proof that democracy did not need to humiliate its enemies to prove its strength. And for the Germans, the lesson was profound. In the flicker of footlights, they discovered the one thing their regime had feared most: freedom of thought. Under those wooden rafters and painted curtains, something irreversible was happening. The theater was no longer just a project. It had become a crossroads, where defeat turned into reflection, and reflection into awakening. But the true power of that awakening would only be revealed when the plays reached their peak, when both captor and captive, sitting in the same hall, witnessed what art could do to the heart of a soldier. December 24, 1944, Camp Algona, Iowa. A bitter wind swept across the frozen prairie, rattling the barbed wire like chimes. Inside the camp, every barrack glowed with the faint orange light of stoves. Outside, snow blanketed the fields in silence. At the center of the compound stood a building unlike any other. A small wooden theater, its roof dusted with frost, its doorway lined with pine branches gathered by prisoners earlier that week. Inside, a sign written in careful German script read, "Weihnachtsabend, Theatergruppe Algona." Christmas Eve. Rows of benches filled the hall, American guards in uniform, German soldiers in worn wool coats. No ranks tonight, no orders, just faces, tired and uncertain. The curtain rose. On stage, German prisoners performed a play they had written themselves, Heimkehr, meaning homecoming. It told the story of a soldier returning from a lost war to find his village destroyed and his faith broken. The man wrestled with guilt, love, and the question of whether redemption was still possible. There were no overt political lines, but every man in that room understood the subtext. It was about them, all of them. As the play unfolded, the air grew still. The lead actor, a former Wehrmacht lieutenant, stood under the dim glow of a single light, delivering a monologue that silenced even the guards. "I believed in a dream," he said softly, in German, "and the dream turned to ash in my hands. But still I breathe. Still I must learn how to live." Somewhere in the audience, an American sergeant, whose brother had been killed in Normandy, stared at the stage and felt something he hadn't expected: pity. The play ended not with triumph, but with silence. The actor dropped to his knees, his face lit by the stage lamp. The curtain fell slowly. For several seconds no one moved. Then came the applause, hesitant at first, then thunderous. Guards and prisoners alike stood clapping, some wiping their eyes discreetly. It wasn't a victory parade or a surrender ceremony. It was something else entirely, a moment of shared recognition that beyond the war, beyond ideology, there remained the fragile, enduring core of being human. Afterward, American officers shook hands with the German performers. One offered his cigar to the lead actor. Another simply said that was real. Outside, the snow kept falling. From the watchtower, a sentry could see the warm light spilling from the theater windows, a flicker of peace in a world still burning. The camp's education officer recorded the event in his report. The prisoners' Christmas performance demonstrated remarkable emotional and intellectual depth. It appears that exposure to art and fair treatment has led to a noticeable change in attitude among many of the men. They speak more freely, less defiantly. Their conversations reveal reflection, even remorse. It was a small note buried in bureaucratic paperwork. But within it lay the essence of something extraordinary, a transformation born not of punishment but of empathy. In the weeks that followed, more plays were performed, comedies, dramas, moral tales. The atmosphere within the camp shifted subtly. Hostility faded. Guards and prisoners exchanged greetings. Theater, it turned out, had done what force could not. It had dismantled walls built not of wood and wire, but of hate and fear. Word of the Algona Theater spread to other camps. At Camp Trinidad in Colorado, prisoners began staging The Devil's General, a play banned in Germany for its anti-Nazi tone. At Camp Tonkawa, a musical comedy drew laughter from both sides. But none matched the quiet power of that Christmas Eve in Algona, when art became an act of reconciliation. For many who witnessed it, that night remained etched in memory. Years later, one American guard would recall, "It was strange. We were still enemies. But for those few hours, we were just men, watching a story about loss. And somehow we all understood it. That understanding, brief, fragile, yet undeniable, became the heart of the experiment. And as winter gave way to spring, the theater's meaning began to evolve again. It was no longer just a place for performance. It became a space for reckoning, where the prisoners, through art, began confronting the very system that had once defined them. The curtain had fallen on the play, but not on its message. The next act would unfold not on stage, but in the minds of the men who had seen it, a slow awakening that would challenge everything they once believed. The morning after the Christmas play, something felt different in Camp Algona. The air was the same, sharp with frost, scented faintly of coal smoke. But the silence had changed. The guards noticed it first. The usual tension at roll call was gone. Men stood straighter, not in defiance but in calm. The arguments that sometimes erupted over rations or work details faded. Even the hardened officers among the prisoners seemed subdued, contemplative. For weeks, they talked of little else but the performance. One guard overheard two German sergeants arguing quietly outside the canteen. "It was only a play," one said. The other shook his head. "No, it was something else. It reminded me who I was before the war." That was precisely what the Americans had hoped, though few of them could have imagined it would work so. Well, the reports from Camp Algona reached Washington by early 1945. They described not only the remarkable discipline and productivity of the prisoners, but also a subtle moral shift. Some had begun to question the Nazi system openly. Others requested books on philosophy or democracy. A few even volunteered to help with translation and education programs. Psychologists from the Special Projects Division began studying the phenomenon. They found that theatrical programs combined with humane treatment led to measurable reductions in hostility and increased cooperation. In short, art, empathy, and fairness were reprogramming the mindset of war. Across the country, similar scenes unfolded. At Camp Trinidad, Colorado, prisoners produced a drama titled Der letzte Befehl, The Last Order. It told of a German officer who defies his superiors to save civilians from execution. The performance drew gasps from the audience, a moral inversion of everything the Nazi code had demanded. At Camp Swift, Texas, POWs staged The Robbers by Friedrich Schiller, a play about conscience and rebellion. American guards reported that discussions after the show lasted long into the night. At Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, a group of young German officers formed an orchestra and began performing alongside local American bands. Their concerts, initially private, eventually included civilians. Music, it seemed, could cross any border. By spring 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin, the world inside these camps was evolving faster than the world outside. The prisoners received news of the Reich's collapse through camp radios and newspapers. When word came that Hitler was dead, many reacted not with grief but with stunned silence. Some stood apart, heads bowed. Others sat for hours staring at the ground. That evening in the Algona Theater, a small group of POWs gathered without fanfare. They placed a single candle at the edge of the stage. One man, a former teacher from Hamburg, spoke softly. "The play is over," he said. "Now we must learn how to live again." The symbolism was not lost on anyone. The stage that had once reflected their inner turmoil now became a space of mourning and of rebirth. American officers, too, began to see the deeper implications. They had not merely pacified their prisoners. They had engaged in moral reconstruction. A few even questioned whether such programs should continue after the war, not as control, but as cooperation. One officer wrote in his final report, "If we can teach them through kindness what tyranny could not teach them through fear, then perhaps there is hope for a better peace." The theater program was quietly recognized as one of the war's most successful psychological operations, though it was never called that publicly. In Germany, meanwhile, cities lay in ruins, millions displaced, millions dead. Yet many of the POWs returning from America would later become teachers, civil servants, and cultural leaders in the new Federal Republic. Some credited their camp experiences, and specifically, the theater's MO, with shaping their post-war beliefs. In 1948, a journalist interviewing former prisoners noted a recurring phrase: "The Americans treated us as human beings, and so we became human again." What had begun as a moral experiment had evolved into something far greater, a blueprint for re-education, reconciliation, and the moral foundations of post-war democracy. The small stage at Camp Algona, built with scrap wood and guarded by men in olive drab, had become, in retrospect, a rehearsal for the reconstruction of a nation's soul. For the Americans who witnessed it, the lesson endured. Mercy, when offered without weakness, could be the most powerful weapon of all, and for the Germans who lived it, the memory of that lighted stage, the warmth, the applause, the understanding, would outlast the echoes of war. May 1945. The war was over. Germany lay in ruins, cities shattered, millions homeless, the nation's conscience fractured beyond recognition. Across the Atlantic, behind barbed wire fences that now seemed purposeless, thousands of German POWs awaited word of their future. For many, the end of the war did not bring celebration, but uncertainty. They had survived, yes, but what awaited them beyond the wire? Families scattered, homes destroyed, a homeland divided by occupation. In the American camps, the news arrived quietly. There were no cheers, no flags. Some men wept. Others stared in disbelief. A few sang softly, and not hymns of victory, but laments of loss. And yet beneath that sorrow, something else stirred. Understanding. Months earlier, many had still spoken of loyalty, of the Führer, of Germany's destiny. Now those words sounded hollow. The plays they had performed, the music they had played, the books they had read, all of it had changed the way they saw themselves. When the U.S. War Department began repatriating prisoners in 1946, it did so with cautious optimism. The re-education experiment, though never publicly proclaimed, had shown results. Reports from dozens of camps described prisoners returning home with new perspectives, more critical of authoritarianism, more aware of moral responsibility. The data was subtle but unmistakable. In post-war Germany, the most stable democratic communities often included men who had been POWs in the United States. Historians later called them the silent transmitters of American values. Letters sent years later tell the story best. One, written by a former POW named Carl Schaefer, reads, "In your country I learned what freedom feels like, not in grand speeches, but in small things. The right to read, to laugh, to think without fear. When I returned home, I could not forget it. For the Americans, too, the memory endured." Guards who had once watched over the prisoners began to reflect on their role in something far larger than military duty. At a 1950 reunion of former Camp Algona personnel, one officer said, "We built them a theater, and somehow it built us too. It reminded us what we were fighting for." The camps themselves changed form after the war. Many were dismantled, their lumber sold or given to local communities. The theater at Camp Algona, however, was preserved, converted into a museum decades later, a quiet monument to a forgotten chapter of humanity in war. Meanwhile, the academic architects of the program compiled their findings. The Special Projects Division reported that cultural engagement had been far more effective than propaganda in reshaping attitudes. Theater, music, and education had worked not through persuasion, but through participation. They concluded that freedom could not be taught, it had to be experienced. In Germany, as the nation rebuilt under Allied supervision, this principle found echo in the policies of Reconstruction. Former POWs became teachers, journalists, and civic leaders. Some founded local theater groups in the late 1940s, continuing the tradition that had begun behind barbed wire. In 1948, in a small town near Bremen, a group of returned prisoners staged a play titled The Bridge. It told of soldiers who learned too late that true victory lies not in conquest but in understanding. The audience included American occupation officers, Afterward, one of them wrote in his diary, "Theirs was not a play. It was a confession. The experiment had come full circle. What began as a wartime necessity, keeping prisoners occupied, had evolved into a moral exchange that neither side expected. For the United States, it was proof that power could be tempered with decency. For the Germans, it was the first lesson in a long education toward democracy. And yet, even as peace returned, the memory of those days behind the wire lingered, quiet, bittersweet, and profoundly human. But the full reckoning, the deeper meaning of what that theater had accomplished, would unfold only in the years that followed, when the men who once acted under guard returned to rebuild a nation from ashes. The war's echoes faded slowly, but the lessons learned behind barbed wire endured. By the late 1940s, as Europe rebuilt, the former German POWs who had spent years in American camps began returning to civilian life. They were older, thinner, and burdened by what they had seen, yet changed in ways few could have predicted. Many spoke of America not as a conqueror, but as a paradox. It had defeated them in war, but restored something in them that their own regime had taken away: the sense of being human. These men returned to a homeland in moral collapse. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden were reduced to rubble. Millions of widows and orphans wandered through ruins. Hunger and despair were constant. The question facing Germany was no longer military, it was spiritual. How could a nation that had worshipped destruction learn to build again? And it was here that the strange memory of the camp theaters reemerged. Former prisoners who had once performed under American guard began forming local drama groups and cultural societies. They brought with them an understanding that theater could heal, that art could rebuild dignity. Some of these small groups, in Bremen, Lübeck, and Stuttgart, became the foundations of post-war civic theaters that still exist today. Others entered journalism, education, or local government. They carried with them ideas first encountered in captivity: freedom of speech, equality before law, moral responsibility. Sociologists studying post-war Germany later noted a striking pattern. Communities with large numbers of returning POWs from the United States showed stronger support for democratic values and civic participation. One historian described them as carriers of conscience. Letters exchanged between former guards and prisoners tell of friendships that defied old boundaries. A former U.S. sergeant named Tom Haskins kept correspondence with a German POW, Friedrich Müller, for over 20 years. In one letter from 1964, Müller wrote, "When you built us that theater, we thought you were mocking us. Now I see, it was the first stone in the bridge we needed to cross." The story of those theaters eventually faded from public memory, overshadowed by the larger dramas of the Cold War and Reconstruction. Yet their legacy lived quietly in archives, memoirs, and in the moral DNA of post-war Europe. In the United States, historians revisiting the POW program decades later were astonished by its scope. Over 400 camps, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and among them, thousands who left America not bitter, but grateful. The success of the re-education effort shaped later U.S. policies in occupied Germany and Japan. Military planners recognized that humane treatment, cultural engagement, and freedom of expression were not luxuries. They were tools of stability. But perhaps the most remarkable outcome was not political at all. It was personal. In 1971, the town of Algona held a small ceremony to commemorate the old POW camp. Among the attendees were former guards and a handful of German veterans who had returned to visit. They stood together in front of the restored wooden theater, the same one built nearly 30 years earlier. Photographs from that day show men in their 50s shaking hands, smiling quietly beneath the American flag and the German tricolor. No speeches of triumph, no grand rhetoric, only gratitude and remembrance. One former POW placed a small wreath at the stage's edge. He whispered, "This is where I learned freedom." The theater still stands today, part museum, part memorial. Visitors walk its narrow aisles, reading old playbills, faded photographs, and the simple words painted above the stage: "Kunst überlebt den Krieg." Art survives war. It is a truth that time has not erased. The camps are gone. The soldiers have passed. But the light from that small stage, built by enemies, shared by men who once sought to destroy each other, still glows in history's long night. And from that light, one final reflection emerges, not about war, but about what it means to remain human within it. War reduces men to numbers, divisions, battalions, statistics. But within the quiet fences of those American camps, something defied that reduction. A theater built from scrap wood and guarded by rifles became proof that even amid global destruction, the human spirit seeks creation. The story of the German POW theaters is not one of triumph, but of transformation. It reminds us that power need not humiliate to prove itself, and that compassion, when practiced with conviction, can become a weapon stronger than any gun. For the American Guards, it was a test of principle. Could they uphold the ideals of democracy in the presence of their defeated enemies? For the prisoners, it was a test of identity. Could they find their humanity again after serving a system that had tried to erase it? The answer came not through politics or punishment, but through art, through words spoken under dim lights, through laughter shared across language, through silence that carried more weight than applause. History often remembers the great battles, Normandy, Stalingrad, Midway, but it is in moments like those at Camp Algona that we glimpse what victory truly means, not the destruction of an enemy, but the redemption of the human heart. In the end, the stage built for prisoners became a stage for the future. From it emerged men who would help rebuild a new Germany, one grounded not in obedience but in understanding. The wooden planks have aged now, their paint faded, their curtains still. Yet the idea they carried endures, that even in war, civilization must not surrender its soul. And somewhere, in that small theater on the Iowa plains, the echoes of that first applause still linger, soft, defiant, eternal, because the real triumph of war was not won on the battlefield. It was won in the light of a stage where enemies became men again,